Hey everybody, welcome to the last week of new content. This is going to be a slightly briefer lecture than normal. We've had like one or two of those here and there, and it's a little bit more casual since it's the end of the semester and also it's so cold in my house. I'm wearing a hoodie this time, so don't worry, I got my buttons next to me. You know, the nice clothes. We're still here, we're still fancy, we're still classy. Let's get ready and let's learn some foreign policy. So, learning objectives today, a lot of the concepts we're going to cover are just general ways of understanding and applying theories to better understand the degree of justness or the general predictability of foreign policy. We'll look at mutually assured destruction, MAD theory, just war theory. We're going to look at acts of terrorism and the nuances of that issue. We're also going to look at the relationship between Congress and the presidency in times of foreign conflict and look at some of the entities on the international stage, as well as explore the way we influence other nations through either soft or hard power. So let's go into this. Just war theory. So when we talk about just war theory, I have two great videos on Eagle Online available for you this week. But we look at there are two general dimensions of just war theory, and then there are also two dimensions of self-defense. So let's look at just war theory to begin with. There is jus ad bellum, which presents a set of conditions under which a resort to war is morally legitimate. Basically, think of it this way: in what circumstances is it just for us to engage in a military conflict? And then jus in bello identifies conditions in which soldiers and states must and can conduct themselves during said conflict. So we look at this and we see, when we translate this to simpler English, we see that it basically states that damages caused by going to war must be, and emphasizes, proportional to the possible damages of not going to war. What do we mean by this? There has to be a clear enough threat that our engagement and our military engagement will be less problematic, or it will be at least proportional to the possible damages, harms that would have come with us not intervening in the conflict. If that is the circumstance, then according to just war theory, jus ad bellum, your engagement in that conflict is just, morally just. And then jus ad bello, we see civilians cannot be killed in conflict. We see a lot of the dimensions of how we engage, how we deal with prisoners of war and those that are missing in action, and how we must have moral righteousness when engaging in military conflicts as citizens and as states. Now, when we look at defense, self-defense at large from a state perspective, you have to understand that there are two general approaches. You can either maintain a preemptive self-defense approach or a preventive self-defense approach. Now, what are the differences between the two? We look at preemptive as in those acting preemptively believe that the adversary, their enemy, is about to attack, that the assault is inevitable, and that a preemptive strike, which would be proportional to the possible damages, can eliminate the threat or at least reduce the harm that would happen if we did not engage in this conflict. So preemptive, heavy reliance on the jus ad bellum aspect of just war theory, focusing on at times when a threat is objectively right at your door, you may intervene with a proportional response that would mitigate the harms that could come if you did not intervene. Now, preventive self-defense, on the other hand, is when a state believes that war with a potential adversary is possible but not guaranteed, or it is generally likely at some future date. And at this particular moment, we have an advantage. We have an advantage that if we wait, we may be able to lose important military advantages. So we must maintain preventive self-defense to ensure that we do not have adversaries that build up the potential to present a stark and abrasive attack on our nation. So preventive self-defense, think of it as you are maintaining a lower threshold for engagement, while preemptive, that is preventive. Preemptive is where you have a somewhat last second approach that really heavily emphasizes on the jus ad bellum dimension of just war theory, waiting till it is clear and objectively provable that the possible damages of not going to war are significantly worse than the damages that will be incurred by us engaging with this conflict. So just war theory, in more detail, those videos provide a great analysis of how this can be utilized to determine if past military engagement or future military engagement is morally righteous. So when we talk about military engagement at large, we understand that as hard power. But that's not the only way we can exert our influence on other nations on the international stage. It's not the only way the United States exerts its foreign policy. So, what is the difference between hard and soft power? Hard power, we think of it quite simply, it's what we visualize when we think of the preventive or preemptive self-defense. It is coercing another nation through official military or, and I want to emphasize, or economic means. What are official military means? Think of troop deployments, think of military dominance in a certain nation, certain region, alliances with neighboring nations to send troops into that region, build up the military stance of our nation. But we understand this goes far beyond simple troops and arms on the ground. We see this as also economic sanctions, implementations of tariffs, domestic subsidies to help solidify those tariffs at certain times, act as hard powers, strong-handed coercions for alliances within our foreign policy. We see some examples of this. We, of course, know the troop deployments in Afghanistan and the retraction of those troops in the year 2020. We also know the economic sanctions placed on North Korea that have been maintained for decades at this point, heavily restricting their ability to trade with the international stage due to their building up of nuclear arms. We also see economic sanctions on Russia post-Ukrainian conflict, as we've had a ebb and flow of strengthening and maintaining our economic sanctions on the state to encourage them to have lesser hard powers within the state of Ukraine. So we see beyond simple hard power efforts, we do have soft power efforts. These are diplomatic engagements in which we try and influence another state through our culture and diplomacy. Think of the basic examples of diplomacy, are heads of state meeting with other heads of state, creating treaties, creating alliances, and drafting guidelines for how we can work together with other nations. Outside of this, there are other soft powers that the United States has a unique strength over distributing. That's our culture. We influence other nations exponentially through our culture via McDonald's implementations, opening those businesses abroad. Nike, I mean, think of how big of a brand Nike is in states like China. Music, I mean, Taylor Swift is not just a US phenomenon, even though I don't listen to it. It's pretty big. But we know that influences other nations as well, creating a more positive view of among other citizens of the US citizen and the US state, creating soft power diplomacy and encouraging the engagement and positive relations between nations. Now, when we look at the role our domestic government has in this effort, we have to understand that there is a divide between the powers allocated to Congress and the powers allocated to our president. We know in modern politics, we see that the presidency has a strengthened role in foreign relations. But we also remember that when we look back at the Constitution, a lot of these powers, like declaring war, were originally granted to our Congress. But it took legislation to expand the influence of our presidency while also providing more concrete restrictions on how the president can act during times of foreign conflict. So let's look at one piece of legislation implemented in 1973 to better understand this. The War Powers Act of 1973. This is where we saw a natural tendency for the increase of president's role in the years prior. World War II was the last time the United States Congress had officially declared war, but we had seen since World War II, we had engaged in numerous conflicts, and there was a call to restrict the power of the presidency in times of conflict. So what did we do with this act? For one, when we look at it generally, it strengthened Congress during conflict. It helped reinforce some of those powers that were originally granted to Congress and grant those powers back. So what are the two main ways in which we strengthen Congress through this act? One, the president must provide notice to Congress within 48 hours of deploying U.S. armed forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities are imminent. So what do we know? How do we view that? The president must tell the sitting members of Congress that we have had certain deployments, and that has to be within 48 hours of said deployment. And why do they have to notify Congress? Because Congress then must approve within 60 days of said deployment. And if they do not get that congressional approval, the troops must be sent back home. So we have a 60-day period in which if approval has not been granted by Congress, there is an immediate withdrawal with a 30-day window for withdrawal. So this strengthened the powers of Congress, and while still enabling the president to act immediately in times of need. So finding more nuance and specific details about how we will operate in relation to our presidency and Congress. And what is the underlying foundation of why we had to have this legislation and why there is this interplay between the powers of the president and the powers of Congress? Because war, simply put, costs money. And when we look at the allocation of money within our federal government, that is a power, the power of the purse, that is granted exclusively to our Congress. Well, the president may be able to deploy troops for certain amounts of time for being able, in order to be able to respond quickly and starkly to international threats. We also have to see that Congress has the power and responsibility of funding those missions and making sure that if if Congress does not have any influence over the deployment of troops, then we have a diminished influence over the power of the purse within Congress. So we see the War Powers Act of 1973 was intended to build up the powers of Congress, relying on the foundations that they have the power of the purse. And when it comes to military engagement, we must fund it to a certain degree. So we must also have approval from Congress. So when we talk about that international stage, there are some collectives and agreements that we must understand because of how much we engage with them in relations to U.S. foreign policy. So let's start off right off the bat with the only one of these entities that does not still exist today, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. This was an elimination of tariffs between three nations, U.S., Canada, and Mexico, our bordering allies, in order to create more positive trade and easy access of easy transportation of goods between our borders. This would oftentimes build up the specialization of certain industries. More free trade, economists argue, is a key ingredient to being able to specialize. What do we mean by specialization? In the United States, we have a service industry that really excels. We sell goods and we sell services to many, many individuals that were oftentimes manufactured and built elsewhere because, well, we benefit from low labor laws and low labor pay in other nations and are able to import those goods here and make profits by distribution of those goods. That is a form of specialization. Without open trade between the nations, we would not be able to benefit from that degree of specialization. So that's why you generally see economists encouraging for economic open trade and less trade barriers. You see a great work, a more graduate level, but written by Ha-Joon Chang, and it is titled Kicking Away the Ladder, which he focuses on the developed nations in the 18th, 19th centuries really built up their economic standing through free trade agreements. And then they kind of discouraged other nations from implementing those same agreements. That's where you get into the weeds, the graduate level discussion. But NAFTA was an agreement to implement a protected agreement of free trade between three entities. Now, this was dismantled, but it was replaced. It was dismantled during the first Trump presidency, but then was replaced by the USMCA, which is a very similar agreement between the entities that has diminished trade barriers between the three nations. So we see, although that was changed, we no longer have NAFTA. We do have the USMCA, which is very similar, just like how when we look at the European Union in a few seconds, we will also understand that in 2020 the UK had left the European Union, but they still stand at the same position they were previously on the global stage, just minus no involvement from the UK government. So let's continue on. Let's talk about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was an alliance designed as a military pact to push back against Soviet expansion during what we know as the Cold War, when we were focusing on the diminishing influence of the Soviet states or those Soviet satellite states in the Caucasus and Eastern European and Central Asian region of the world. This was utilized to include US, Canada, many Western European nations, and some post-Soviet nations to maintain an alliance pushing back against the military role of the Soviet Union. Now, we also remember the United Nations is a collective that was formed in response to World War II to have a unified government, unified, I guess you could say, global government in which we have the opportunity for our nation's leaders to engage with each other before the results occur, which tend to be military involvement. So we have 193 member nations with a very clear hierarchical system, and that's something that if you go into political science, you'll probably take a class, Model UN, in which you'll really get a lot of a greater understanding of how this institution operates. We do not have enforcement mechanisms within the UN, basically stating the UN themselves cannot call for a certain action and then ensure that there are police entities ensuring that that action takes place, but they do uh, general calls for action that influence the state governments and provide a roadmap for how we will encourage certain conflicts to be addressed, oftentimes providing a starting point for debate revolving around certain issues. We see one of the first acts in the 1950s that the United Nations had engaged with was a proposal to end the conflicts that were occurring and that still persist today, but in the region of Israel-Palestine, as they proposed the first two-state solution, which was immediately struck down at the time, which if you're interested, I can provide more detail via email or Zoom. So continuing on, we remember the European Union. It is the primarily economic and political alliance between European states. We know from after 2020 Brexit, the UK has left the European Union, but we know this as an economic agreement in which we have implemented a common currency, common tariffs, free trade, similar to NAFTA or the USMCA, in which we have lower trade barriers between a collective of nations to encourage better relations between them and encourage specialization among them. Think about Europe benefits from this, Germany benefits from this immensely through their ability to specialize so heavily on automobile manufacturing. That's one example. You can think of the European Union as the European version of US federalism, but more confederally oriented. When we look at and rewind to that beginning lecture where we talked about unitary, confederal, and federal systems of government, we remember the US under the Articles was the only example of a sovereign state maintaining a confederal system. But the European Union, although it is not one sovereign state, sovereign as an independent, it is not one independent state, but it does represent a form of a confederal system with power concentrated in the individual sovereign entities, the unique nations, France, Germany, UK when they were, remember, and then their power was distributed upwards as they had the ability to dictate the agreements made by the European Union when they were able to come to agreements, similar to how the Articles of Confederation operated before the US Constitution was implemented. So the European Union economic agreement, lower barriers of trade with a common currency. Think about if the United States had different currencies within each state and how difficult that would be. Well, that's why we have the common currency of the US dollar, and that is similar to what Europe did through the European Union. Now, we also want to remember non-governmental organizations. These are non-profit. They do not operate to make profit, to make money, or to increase the salaries of those who run them. They are non-profit organizations that promote interests within global ramifications. A lot of NGOs currently are operating, trying to provide food supplies to those in need in regions of Palestine and Israel. You see a lot of entities focusing on not the interests of one state over another, but the needs of the humans and the citizens that are harmed by these international conflicts. So we see non-governmental organizations oftentimes operating without aims of obtaining profit, but aims of providing the resources and needs of individual citizens globally during periods of global conflict. So when we talk about politics, we have to understand that in recent years, nuclear war is a point of considerable debate. We have two contemporary nations that, when you look at the overall debate regarding our foreign policy and the relations that nuclear weapons have, two primary nations that pose the largest nuclear threats, Iran and North Korea, both building up their arsenals. We see Iran, we engaged in a military conflict, bombing some of their nuclear facilities, although we are not sure exactly what the results were, but that happened just a few months ago at the beginning of the recent administration. We see North Korea is a issue we do not have to necessarily cover in detail today, as we know they have been implementing frequent tests over the last few decades of nuclear arsenals and building up their nuclear weaponry. We see that when we talk about nuclear war, there is a period where we can used as a case study to understand what nuclear conflict looks like. It is often a fight in which you do not have lives lost, but fear building. We look back at the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union and the United States faced off with nuclear arms pointing in both directions, with moments of immensely close calls like the Cuban missile crisis and many other moments in which we were just a few decisions away from nuclear conflict. But there was a concept that political scientists identify as the reason why we never entered that official nuclear conflict, nuclear fallout, and there's only been 2 nuclear bombs dropped in the world, and only at a time when there was only one nation with the armory to do so. So this is mutually assured destruction, MAD theory. It is a theory that states that if a nuclear attack were to ever be engaged by one superpower, it would almost guaranteed be met with an overwhelming nuclear counterattack from the nation that was first under threat. So, simply put, if North Korea were to ever think to send a nuclear weapon to the United States, before that nuclear weapon were to hit the ground, it is almost guaranteed that the United States would send an overwhelming nuclear counterattack to the state of North Korea. And all nations with nuclear arms have this general understanding. And there are some great films that depict this relationship. There's one that came out recently. I think it was A House of Dynamite. If you want to take some of your casual time and try and get a better understanding of these things, of course, don't view the content of that film as objectively truthful and 100% accurate, but it is a artistic portrayal of this concept, mutually assured destruction. If we were to get involved in nuclear fallout, if one were to nuke our nation, the first response is often a counterattack once we've identified the assailant. So, mutually assured destruction is the reason why we are able to prevent, on a theoretical level, nuclear fallout globally. Now, when we talk about the Cold War, the conflict that stemmed from 1945 to 1991, in which we saw those nuclear bomb shelters being built, those nuclear drills that students would have to go through at schools as they would have to hide under their desks and be prepared for understanding what these sirens and their local communities were signaling. We also remember there were certain treaties at the time that helped prevent and stabilize the nuclear arms race. We look back at the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty made between the US and Soviet Union, which stabilized the building of nuclear arms, capping the amount of arsenals that each entity were to build. And we understand there was a contemporary impact to the old Cold War. Remember this focus during the Cold War: push back against Soviet expansion, the communism spreading from the red state of Russia. You heard those sentiments. You see McCarthyism, the Red Scare, the fear of these ideologies, which resulted in people being blacklisted within U.S. industries. A very, very fearful period in U.S. history, especially dominating in the 1950s with McCarthyism. But we see that during this time period, when you look at the most simplified understandings of politics, the enemy of your enemy can at times be your friend. And we see this example when we look at the Middle East, in particular Afghanistan. There was a period where we were hyper fixated on this pushing back the Soviet expansion. And guess what was occurring? The Soviet state was expanding in the early 90s into the state of Afghanistan, the more open-ended state of Afghanistan. And uniquely, the Afghanistan state had many Mujahideen fighters who were successful in pushing back against Soviet expansion. So the U.S. identified this collective who was in need of greater arms and greater stance to be able to successfully and continually combat Russian influence. And that collective was the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The U.S. funded many parts of the Mujahideen in that region, and as we know, through a oversimplified projection of history, the Mujahideen, the leaders in that collective, eventually resulted in being a lot of the leaders representing the Taliban today. The collective that we do see currently holds control of the Afghanistan government, although on the international stage we have not recognized through executive powers the Taliban rule as an official leader of the state of Afghanistan, resulting in greater sanctions, greater hard power influence presented on the region and the state, and a restriction on their ability to build up and stand respected on the international stage. So we see a downstream effect whenever we look at foreign policy. Sometimes the hyperfixation of diminishing one foreign threat can create a downstream threat to be dealt with decades later. Now, when we talk about this time period, we're also talking about a concept called the Great Power Competition. This is where we saw a fight for hegemony being the political, economic, and military dominance of one state over all others. Think of who are the great power leaders of the globe, who is in control of the international stage. We know there is a current fight for hegemony between the US, Russia, and China, trying to identify that dominance either through economic relations, military, or political influence. The US having a unique benefit and strength in this conflict as we have such extensive soft power through our culture. And we see this is still persisting today. Today, the great power competition, the main takeaway from this slide being the key definition of hegemony, the ability to have political, economic, and military dominance over other states or all other states. So we see the great power competition reveals a key term to be relied on in its course and maintains three actors, US, Russia, and China. Now, when we talk about terrorism in the United States, it is oftentimes misunderstood that terrorism includes threats against the US way of life. It is far more expansive of a term than that. Terrorism includes the systemic attempt to incite fear to gain political ends from any entity. There are terrorist efforts maintained by many collectives that we would not identify as those who would commit those certain acts. We have to understand this term is simply understood as a systemic attempt to incite fear to gain political ends for any entity against any other entity. The first time this term was ever used was actually during the French Revolution in the 1700s, and we can hear the pushback oftentimes using this term to label those as traitors of the state, as we saw a very violent, bloody revolution at that time period in global history. Now, when we look at terrorism in the United States, for one, important to be able to provide a key term that separates it from the United States, but when we talk about its impact on the United States, there are some key things we can understand that bounce back to past lectures. We remember it resulted in the nationalization of airport security, the industry-based definition of nationalization, as we brought airport security under federal responsibility, federal rule, and we see the nationalization of that entity. And that is why in recent months, when we saw the recent government shutdown, what was harmed? Our airports, the ability for TSA to maintain effective checks on individual luggage and security. So nationalization of that industry in response to events like 9/11 and the increased terrorist efforts and the, in a sense, successful effort in that one day in history. We also see heightened domestic surveillance. The Patriot Act implemented days after, in which we saw more surveillance of domestic cell phones and telecommunications. So this was a response to provide better security. Remember, there is always a conflict between liberty and security, and any action by the state is a prioritization of one over the other. The nationalization of airport security, heightened domestic surveillance, and even increased military spending represent focuses on increasing security at the risk of possibly decreasing the liberties in certain circumstances, primarily evident through the example of heightened domestic surveillance, as we've lost a sense of liberty in our use of telecommunication, but increased our sense of security in our daily lives. We see this these conflicts continued throughout the early 2000s when we look at Iraq and the engagement we had in that region, and of course the continued developments that will come out of the region of Afghanistan. Now, this was a quick lecture this week. A lot of just simple overview, a lot of new concepts, mutually assured destruction, just war theory, and we didn't want to dive into too much detail beyond understanding what they were. We also want to make sure we understand some of the entities that exist on the international stage and some of the interests that must always be considered when we talk about foreign policy. the interests of the NGOs, the EU and the UN, those international entities, those agreements we have made, those treaties we have become tied into, NAFTA, USMCA, or NATO. And of course, we also want to make sure we remember the different means in which we could influence other nations, either through soft power, treaties, diplomacy, culture, the greatest ingredient the US has when we consider our foreign policy efforts, and of course, hard powers when we must resort to it. Those hard economic sanctions, the tariffs, the subsidies domestically to tie in with the tariffs, and the deployment of troops. Here are those concrete answers. Make sure you get ready for the end of the course. We have completed all of our assignments. Our quiz is due at the end of this week, but we have our essay due and exam due after the break. So make sure, after you finish your quiz this week, you start reviewing everything on that quiz, on past quizzes, the what do we learn slides, and we're prepared for a final exam, which is cumulative and covers everything talked about in this course. And make sure you turn that essay in by the assigned due date. So make sure you get all that in. Reach out to me if you have any questions. Go over some of your grades, and if there hasn't been if I maybe missed a point in one of your assignments when I was grading it, feel free to reach out and ask me questions. So open ears, please email me. I'm happy to schedule any meeting at any time to help you feel more confident about your grade and end this course strong. Remember, I gave you a lot of comments on your essays, and I know some of them can be a bit confusing, so please reach out and I will provide greater explanation on what I was saying in those comments if need be. Thanks for listening to me. I'm excited to go over a little bit of review with you next week, and here's to ending the course strong. Thank you, guys.